Ryan Reagan, the founding partner of HKExcel. So if you're watching this video right now, I suppose you have your IB Econ paper 1 coming up very soon. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to share with you the top tips that you can use to get a level 7 for your IB Econ paper 2. Okay, so if you use the tips that I share with you in this video, I'm very confident that you will get a level 7, okay, because the paper 2 is not that difficult. Okay, you just need the right strategy, which I'm going to share with you today. Okay, so just by way of introduction, I'm Ryan, and I got a very high level 7 in my IB Econ. Okay, and I'm the founding partner of HKExcel. We've helped over 2,000 IB Econ students in the past few years, and we've helped over 10,000 IB students in general, like through online and in our centers. Okay, so now let's get straight to the IB Econ paper 2. So very quickly, I'll tell you about the exam structure first. I suppose you probably know this as well. Okay, so the first thing, the exam structure. Okay, so there's a part A, there's part A1 and A2. So they will ask you 2 definition questions. So define tariffs, define exchange rate, something like that. Okay, so you need to define 2 terms. And for each definition, it's worth 2 marks. So that's why part A is worth 4 marks. Okay, then you have part B and C. Part B and C are short questions. Okay, each question is worth 4 marks. So part B and C is worth 8 marks in total. Okay, then lastly, you have evaluation, which is an 8-mark question. Okay. So first, I wish to share with you some general tips for approaching the paper. So for part A, B, and C, so a lot of students, before they even start their paper 2, they read through the entire newspaper article, right? Because paper 2 is data response, you get like a newspaper article. So I think if you read the article at the beginning, you actually end up wasting a lot of time. So what I tend to do is, because for part A, B, and C, normally you don't need to read the article to answer those questions. If they ask you to define tariffs, it's not like you need to read the article to define tariffs, so you don't need to read the article. Even for part B and C, most of the time you don't need to read the article. Unless if the question is asking specifically something from the article, you don't need to read the article. That's why in the past, to save time, I normally just answer part A, B, and C directly without reading the article, unless if it's necessary. This will save you a lot of time. And part A, B, and C, it's definition and short question, right? Normally, these questions are very easy to get full marks. So you should definitely aim to get full marks for this question. Because if you get full marks, you already have 12 out of 20, right? And then for part D, that's the hardest part. It's worth 8 marks. But if you get 12 out of 20 for part A to C, even if you get like 4 out of 8 for part D, which is not that great, you will still get a level 7, right? So I'm telling you, part A, B, and C is a lot easier. So try to get full marks. And then for part D, it's evaluation question. For evaluation question, it's more subjective, right? Like different teachers have different different kinds of writing. So it's very hard to guarantee you'll get like a full mark or like a high mark for part D. However, part A to C is very easy and it's very controllable. So try to get full marks for part A to C, and then for part D, if you can get at least 5 out of 8 or 6 out of 8, you will already get a level 7. So that's the general strategy. So now let's get into more detail. So for paper 2, there are 2 sections, right? Section A and Section B. Section A is on trade, international trade. Section B is on development. So basically, in both sections, you need to pick one question, right? So for international trade, you need to pick one data response question. For development, you need to pick one data response question. So, because you only need to answer one question, you don't really have to revise everything. So it is possible for you to revise just some selective topics and still get a high mark, because ultimately, they're not going to test you on the entire topic. They will just pick select parts from the topic, right? So obviously, if you want to maximize your chances of getting a level 7, you should revise everything. Because if you revise everything, then no matter what shows up, you're going to know how to do it. But as students, we have time limits, right? You may not be able to study everything. That's normal. So if you don't have time to study everything, these are the topics I would suggest for you to focus on. If you just focus on the topics on the screen, there's a very high chance you can still get a level 7. Of course, if you want to be safe, study all the topics. But if you want to save time, just study these topics here. Okay, so for international trade, focus on trade protection like tariffs, subsidies, quotas, etc., and the pros and cons. So study the entire chapter related to trade protection. Exchange rates as well. Study the entire chapter, like the advantages and disadvantages of a high exchange rate versus a low exchange rate, etc., etc. Then economic integration. So economic integration, you learn about things like custom unions, free trade areas, etc. Right? So make sure so these 3 topics are really what you should focus on. There are other topics like terms of trade and balance of payments. Those are less important. Even if you ignore terms of trade and balance of payment, there's still a very high chance you can get a level 7 in your paper 2, as long as you study the other topics well. Now, for development, there are 3 topics I think are most important as well, like multinational corporations, like FDI, right? And the second important topic is market-oriented versus interventionist policies, right? And the third one is aid. So for development, I think these topics are like, if you can't study the entire development chapter, these are the 3 sections I would suggest you to focus on. These are the most common ones, okay? So hopefully this slide, what I taught you just now, it can help you to save time. If you don't have time to study for everything, these are the most important topics to focus on. But make sure you're master in each of these topics, okay? Now, for part A, it's definition. So definition, obviously, you just need to be able to memorize them. So I would suggest you to study for this. You should, have a list of all the definitions that can show up from the topics I suggested to you just now. And then you should test yourself at home. Make sure you memorize the definitions, okay? You memorize it by testing yourself at home. And another tip is that for each definition, if you're able to give an example for each definition, it will actually increase your chances of getting good marks. So if you have an okay definition and you have an example, you can get 2 out of 2. But if you have an okay definition without an example, you may only get 1 out of 2. So the example can save you a mark. Okay, get it? So that's why you should include an example to define your term. Now, part B and C, most of the time part B and C will involve a diagram. Okay, so the diagram itself is worth 2 marks. So you need to make sure your diagram is fully labeled and correct to the context. So I'll explain to you what I mean in an example later. Okay, and then you need to explain your diagram clearly and logically, and you need to be sure to answer the question. If you do all of these things, you'll get 4 out of 4. Okay, so I'll show you an example. So one common example for part B might be something like this. Explain how tariffs in the US for steel affect domestic producers. So first step, you draw a tariff diagram. Okay, for the x-axis, you want to put quantity of steel in tons. So the reason, so you don't want to just put quantity. You need to put quantity of steel in tons because the question is about steel. Okay, this is very important. It will save you 1 mark. For the y-axis, you want to put price of steel in brackets USD because this is specific to the context. We're talking about the US market here, right? So this will save you a mark. Then you explain the tariff diagram. Explain it in detail. So for example, you will say something like, well, before the tariff, the price of steel is at PW. After the tariff, the price of the imported steel will increase to P2, and then domestic production will increase from Q1 to Q2. The domestic quantity demand will decrease from Q4 to Q3, something like that. And then lastly, you need to answer the question. So you can say domestic producers will get more revenue because their production increases to Q2, whereas the price increases to P2. So with the higher price and a higher quantity, domestic producers can earn a higher revenue, right? So something like that would be sufficient. Okay, so see, the diagram is correct to the context, and you need to explain the diagram, and you need to answer the question. This is the formula for every question. So for part D. So part D is normally evaluation question, right? So what you need to do for part D is, normally what I do is this. So normally, because part D is normally about advantage and disadvantage, for example, evaluate a tariff or evaluate high exchange rate, something like that. So it has to do with advantage and disadvantage. So what I normally do is, before I start part D, I'm going to read through the entire article and I'm going to find advantages and disadvantages related to the topic we're discussing. So for example, if the evaluation question is about tariff, then you read through the article and you find all the advantages related to a tariff and all the disadvantages related to a tariff. So underline everything. Then you can start writing. So paragraph 1, you need to define the terms. So for example, if the evaluation question is about tariff, then you define tariff. But if you already defined the term in part A, you don't need to define it again. And then in your first paragraph, besides the definition, you also want to have a thesis. So just like a sentence that would sort of wrap up your essay. So for example, if you're talking about tariff, you can say, a tariff is a tax on imported goods, and it would benefit certain stakeholders and be harmful to certain stakeholders. Something like that. That can be your thesis. Then your first paragraph, you want to the second paragraph, you talk about the advantages. So what you want is, because for part D, to get a high mark, you need to make references to the article. So what you want to do is you want to quote directly from the article and then elaborate on it. So take a quote from the article, then explain why that is an advantage for the tariff, okay? Or if it's for another topic, then you can relate it to another topic. So basically, you need to state advantages to your case, like to the topic at hand, but you need to quote from the article to back up your arguments, okay? And then for your disadvantages, you do the same. Quote from the article and elaborate on each argument, okay? So if you're confused about how to do this, you can fill in the form in the description. We have like free resources, free sample essays you can download, okay? And then for conclusion, basically there are a couple of ways you can conclude. You can use short run, long run. You can use to a certain extent. So to a certain extent, a tariff is beneficial, something like that. And then you explain. Or you can say the tariff has winners and losers. The winners include blah, 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 and the losers include blah, blah, blah. Or you can use the benefit and cost approach, where you say the benefits outweigh the cost because da 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 da, or the cost outweigh the benefit because da 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 da. Okay? So this is just like general tips for your paper 2. Now, if you want paper 2 sample essays, please fill in the form in the description. So I hope you find this video useful.